Chapter 9, Limitless Funds, the first referendum campaign. It was very discouraging for us when Great Britain went against the decision of the National Convention on the referendum. We realized then that the fix was in and that Britain and Canada were going to do everything in their power to make Confederation happen, whether it was fair or not. All the time I was working at McAvoy's office, but it was becoming awkward. He was clearly working for Confederates, and I clearly was not. No one really knew at first who had put the advertisement in the Daily News announcing the formation of the Union with the American Party. Scott MacDonald was the one who found out. On February 5th, 1948, Canadian High Commissioner Scott MacDonald sent a dispatch to Lester Pearson. I have the honor to refer to my dispatch number 548 of November 26, 1947, respecting the formation of the Union with American Party. It has now been ascertained that two moving spirits in the party are Mr. James Halley, a local lawyer who is the partner of Mr. J.B. McAvoy, chairman of the National Convention, and Mr. Godfrey Sterling, editor of the tabloid newspaper, The Sunday Herald, which has a large and rapidly growing circulation in Newfoundland. It is understood that the promoters of the new party have been putting considerable effort into organizing local groups and trying to outline a plan of campaign. Mr. Jackman and one or two other members of the National Convention are sympathetic. But while the Union with American Party is not in a position to do anything worthwhile in the present campaign, there is no doubt of the very large latent interest in union with the United States as the best solution for Newfoundland's difficulties. I feel certain that if the Commission of Government is retained for a further period, it will be quite impossible to prevent this question being fully explored when the time arrives to set up an alternative form of government. I doubt that the United Kingdom government is fully aware of this situation or of the repercussions it could have. A new administration in Washington might not discourage advances from Newfoundland. And once Newfoundland began to negotiate terms of union with the United States, the question would very soon become a live issue in the Britain West Indies, British Honduras, and British Guiana, more particularly as the officials and leading citizens in all these possessions are much less to the left than the government of the United Kingdom. This is the danger involved in a further period of office for the Commission of Government. By its nature, it can not be more than a temporary expedient, but its continuation now could raise problems of succession that could easily prove unmanageable. Much was at stake in the game now being played out in Newfoundland. The fear of American influence always had a focusing effect on the mind of the High Commissioner. He now informed Governor Gordon MacDonald that it was Jim Haley who had taken out the advertisement for the Union with the American Party, also called the Economic Union Party, in the papers, and the governor passed the word on to Haley law partner, John McAvoy. I stayed as long as I could, said Haley, to get as much information as I could, of course, but after the referendum was called, I left McAvoy's office and went to work on the campaign full-time with Godfrey Sterling and D.I. Jackman. Our greatest achievement was getting Ches Crosby to lead the party. Ches Crosby gave Scott MacDonald a lot to worry about. Faced with the first real threat to Confederation, Scott MacDonald carefully sized up his new enemy. On March 22nd, he reported, Mr. Chesley A. Crosby, former member of the National Convention and prominent Newfoundland fish producer, announced on March 20th in a radio address that he has decided to lead the Party for Economic Union with the United States. Mr. D.I. Jackman, the former head of the party, has given his allegiance to Mr. Crosby. Mr. Crosby says that he believes the economic union with the U.S. would effect a fundamental solution for Newfoundland's economic problem by developing two-way trade with Newfoundland's largest potential market, particularly for fresh fish. Mr. Crosby is aggressive, ambitious, and a man of means, willing to spend it in the pursuit of political power. He presents himself to the people as a man engaged in the fishing industry, who is anxious to see all other engaged in the same industry enjoy the just fruits of their labor. In the elections to the National Convention, he headed the polls in the district of St. John's City West and secured the largest number of votes cast for any single candidate. In spite of the flimsy bias upon which Mr. Crosby has launched in campaigns, his words will almost certainly possess powerful appeal for uniformed fishermen who constitute the bulk of the electorate. The morning after his radio announcement, about 1,000 people called at his headquarters in St. John's to sign on as members of this party, and a considerable volume of telegrams is flowing in from outlying settlements. There was no doubt that Ches Crosby had caught the attention of the Canadians. Paul Bridle, now attached to the Canadian High Commissioner in St. John's, followed up with another dispatch on the Economic Union Party the following week. It is claimed that 40,000 people have expressed the desire to join the party advocating economic union with the United States. This figure is almost certainly exaggerated. Mr. C.A. Crosby and Mr. D. Jameson, his campaign manager, have recently given radio addresses. Mr. Crosby developed his thesis that Confederation would jeopardize Newfoundland's fisheries. The High Commissioner feels that Confederation is valuable on this score. The fishery was the certain main concern of Newfoundlanders. It was the country's chief employer and the source of its largest export. If Confederation would jeopardize Newfoundland's fisheries, then it would jeopardize Newfoundland's ability to survive. Bridle continued. He also thinks that Mr. Crosby's program for economic union with the U.S. will gain many adherents among gullible fisherfolk. If it cannot be shown to be wishful thinking, it was to the same gullible fisherfolk that MacDonald and Bridle hoped to sell Confederation. even if it threatened their livelihoods. Bridle concluded on a more positive note from the Confederate camp. Mr. Gordon Bradley, leader of the Confederation movement, also spoke over the radio recently. He argued the futility of Newfoundland endeavoring to secure economic union with the U.S. He said that it is contrary to established United States commercial policy, which is of a non-discriminatory character, that there would be a strong opposition to such a move on the part of the U.S. fishermen, and that the U.S. would be unwilling merely to please Newfoundland to discriminate against countries such as Canada, which buy vastly more U.S. products than does Newfoundland. The Evening Telegram described economic union with the United States as a wishful thinking, although the Daily News thought that the trade agreement with the Southern Giant was inevitable. Still, Crosby and his new party did have legitimate reasons to believe that some form of economic union with the United States was possible. When at the beginning of the war, the lease basis agreement was signed, giving large tracts of territory and jurisdiction in Newfoundland over to the United States, free of all consideration. Cordell Hull, the U.S. Secretary of State, had released a statement to the Evening Telegram in St. John's. There is one message to Newfoundland which I am definitely authorized to give. It is that when the present emergency is over, the United States will be disposed to consider sympathetically the commercial relationship between Newfoundland and herself, with the view to the development of mutual trade. The Newfoundland government of the day will be very willing, I feel assured, to cooperate in that study. We are assured that the United States desire closer economic relations with Newfoundland, and we hope the day may not be far distant when this prospect will be realized. And in 1941, John D. Hickerson, the U.S. expert on Newfoundland and also Assistant Chief of the State Department's European Affairs Division and Secretary of the American Joint Board of Defense, reiterated that the base agreements did constitute a ground for expecting closer economic relations between the two countries. By now, the relationship between the Canadian High Commissioner in St. John's and the British governor had deteriorated to the point that Ottawa felt a fresh face would be better able to deal with the governor on the tricky issues arising out of the referendum process and the constitutional maneuvering that followed. Scott MacDonald's continuing belief that the governor wanted to stay on in Newfoundland for another 5 to 10 years had brought the two men into several divisive arguments. The intense and bitter haggling over the wording of the ballot paper had used up the last reserve of goodwill between them. The Governor, MacDonald, let it be known to Whitehall that he found the attitude of the Canadian High Commissioner threatening. A word is often sufficient to the diplomatic sensitive is not wise, and the Canadian who enjoyed the upper hand but had no desire to offend the British in any way that might jeopardize the goal in Newfoundland, or indeed their own relationship with the motherland, thereupon appointed Paul Bridle as acting High Commissioner to replace Scott MacDonald. Bridle was already in St. John's as secretary to the High Commissioner's office. Scott MacDonald had done a superb job working with Smallwood to create a strong Confederate organization around the island. But he was both too vocal and too visible for Lester Pearson, who worried that MacDonald's outspoken manner and hands-on management of the Confederate campaign with Smallwood would become public and embarrass Canada, which had often declared publicly that it had no wish to interfere or influence Newfoundland's referendum process. Bridle, able to express thought he did not have the same seniority to preside over the final takeover of power. In due time, the ever-cautious Mackenzie King called Charles Burchell back yet again from Australia to secure the Newfoundland deal. Scott MacDonald never forgave Pearson in St. Laurent for his transfer on May 12, 1948. 7 weeks before the referendum vote, he sent this last defiant dispatch to External Affairs. The outlook in general is good. In leaving Newfoundland to take up my new post in Brazil, I see no reason to revise the forecast in my dispatch number 210 of May 6 that Confederation, bearing some unforeseen developments, will head the polls. During the week, the Commission of Government announced the extension to the 1948 season of the arrangement adopted last year to convert dollar to sterling obtained by the fish sale in Europe. It is emphasized that the arrangement is designed to safeguard the position of the fishermen and to avoid the need for heavy expenditure on relief. The announcement, a copy of which is attached, emphasized that this arrangement will apply only to the 1948 production and that it will not be possible to subsequent years. This blunt warning will go a long way to show Newfoundlanders the inability of the Commission to ensure financial stability and support. Though tardy or advantageous, it is fairly effective substitute for the statement of its inability to provide further financial assistance, which I have frequently argued should be made by the British government. Another question is the difficulty of establishing a satisfactory provincial budget that will enable Newfoundland to carry on the services devolving on it as a province. The discussions revealed a weakness in the terms themselves that was not generally appreciated when they were formulated. The debate on the Canadian terms in the National Convention had in fact revealed that these conditions were financially unsound, and the Convention was correct in refusing to allow Confederation to appear on the ballot. On the basis of those terms, Scott MacDonald had been truculent. I'll spell that one out. Truculent about the Convention's rejection and had characterized the delegates as ungrateful. Lord Addison and Alexander Clutterbuck had both declared the terms to be exceptionally gracious, but ultimately everyone would have to agree that they were in fact unworkable. Back in Ottawa, the High Commissioner was debriefed by the Prime Minister on May 19th. Had a talk of some length with Scott MacDonald, who thinks Newfoundland almost certainly to come into Confederation, but agrees with me it is going to be a source of trouble for some time to come. The only thing to do to save the island from drifting into the hands of the Americans, especially important to Canada. Newfoundland would certainly be a source of trouble under the terms proposed. Nevertheless, and despite their pernicious offerings, King was beginning to style Canada as the savior of the island, though not from poverty, but from the threat of American prosperity. On May 21st, less than 2 weeks before the vote, the Western Star in Corner Brook published a report on the proposal arrangements for the entry of Newfoundland into Confederation, prepared by MacDonald, Currie and Co. of Montreal. It was commissioned by Crosby and the Economic Union Party and represented the first expert outside appraisal of the terms offered by Canada. The local press was quick to advertise its conclusion, as Bridle wrote to External Affairs. The St. John's Daily News and speakers on the radio favoring responsible government have played up the report's predictions of a $4,468,000 provincial deficit, and have emphasized is statements regarding more people having to pay income taxes, per capita debt being vastly increased. The report confirms its own view that too little is known about the impact of union to permit a valid decision of a final nature. Given these misgivings about Confederation, it was becoming clear that any decision about Confederation in a referendum was not only inappropriate, but potentially damaging to Newfoundland. The referendum campaign was vigorously waged by all parties, with the exception of the Commission of Government, which had only one to speak for it, save the governor. The Responsible Government League campaigned across the country. Peter Cashin began to talk about economic union with the United States, but not until late in the game. The Confederates had strong, well-organized teams, and the ubiquitous Joe Smallwood, the St. Paul of Confederation, waged a tirelessly relentless and inspired campaign as he walked across the island to preach the new gospel. Smallwood even tried to convert the new leader of the Union with American Party, according to Harold Horwood. He went to see Crosby, a thing easily arranged since they were old acquaintances who had shared many small business ventures in the past, and offered to make him Premier of Newfoundland if he would discover that the U.S. wasn't interested in economic union with Newfoundland after all, and if, following his discovery, he'd swear allegiance to the Confederation instead. Crosby wasn't interested in Smallwood's offer, but they parted in good terms, according to Jim Halley. The Economic Union Party put on a strong campaign. Geoff Sterling had articles after articles in the Sunday Herald and produced 50 senators who were sympathetic to Newfoundland joining up with the U.S., including Senator Taft and Wagner and other powerful figures. The Christian Science Monitor said that the U.S. could do worse than cultivate Newfoundland for state food. Jameson was a good speaker, and T.I. Jackman and myself, but we were no match for the Confederate campaign or their Canadian money. Horwood provided a colorful account of the financing of the Confederate campaign in his biography of Smallwood. C.D. Howe, Minister of Reconstruction and Supply in King's Government, supplied Ray Patton with a letter of introduction to be used among his friends in the Canadian business community, and sent him off to Senator Gordon Fogo, who was head bag man for the Liberal Party of Canada. Joey, fearing a wiretap, would never mention those names in phone conversations. Talking by phone to Bradley, for instance, Howe became the man who knows how it's done. The senator was simply the man from Fogo. Gordon Fogo gave Patton a copy of the Liberal Party hit list, corporations that could be readily tapped for funds at election time. Many of those corporations turned out to be one branch or another of the liquor businesses. They were merchandisers, brewers, vineyards, and distillers. With a little prodding by way of Howe's letter, they coughed up a surprisingly amount of cash. No one knows just how much, since no records were kept. For example, I myself received a single donation of $3,000 in cash, and spent it in cash, half of the amount on printing bills and half on traveling expenses. Altogether, the Confederate campaign must have cost about $250,000. So we got the money, and Mr. Patton got his senatorship and a profitable string of liquor agencies as a sort of bonus. With seemingly limitless funds now at his disposal, Joey put on the most dazzling campaign in Newfoundland history. Flags, music, guns, bands, marching, blizzards of campaign literature. It seemed less like an election campaign than a national triumph. It was perfectly obvious to everyone that we were outspending the Responsible Government League by a factor of at least 2 or 3 to 1, and there were loud demands from our opponents to know where the money was coming from. Obviously, they said Joey must be a patsy of powerful foreign interests that had designs on Newfoundland, probably just a puppet playing out a script hatched in London and Ottawa. They were right. We were forced to invent fictitious sources of funds, and that's how the story got around that scores of fishermen were sending to their $1 bills and $2 bills, and even a few $4 bills saved from the 19th century, when there really were such things in Newfoundland, each with a little note pinned on saying something like, "God bless you, Mr. Smallwood, for what you're doing for we poor people. We're praying for you." The referendum was held on June 3rd, 1948. In the early hours of the vote, with Responsible Government leading, Mackenzie King confessed once again, "Personally, I would prefer to see Responsible Government carry," and then an agreement made between Newfoundland government that was responsible with the Canadian government. The Responsible Government League and the Economic Union with American parties wished for no less, as did Major Cashin and Albert Perlin. But in the struggles between principles and politics, King's politics ultimately proved to be more powerful. On June 8th, Paul Bridle reported the results of the referendum to the Department of External Affairs. Returns are now virtually complete, only Labrador remaining to report its final count, subject to confirm in writing of returns received by telegraph. The present totals may be taken as substantially representing the final standing of the three forms of government. These totals are: Commission of Government for a period of 5 years, 21,944 votes. Confederation with Canada, 63,110 votes. Responsible Government as it existed in 1933, 69,230. Responsible Government had come first in the referendum for more than 6,000 votes, but without a sufficient overall majority to carry the election. The third place group, the Commission of Government, would therefore be eliminated, and the second referendum was scheduled for July 22nd. As the British had calculated, Confederation would now have a good second chance at winning. The referendum results nevertheless proved that Newfoundlanders were eager to take back control of their country's political affairs. It was a disappointing result for the Economic Union Party, which had hoped for a responsible government victory on the first ballot. Members feared that the Commission of Government supporters, who had chosen the security of the British backing and fair play, would now choose Canadian backing and fair play instead of independence. Bridal assessment of the first referendum results was sober, as he reported back to Ottawa. The blunt fact remains, of course, that Confederation received fewer votes than Responsible Government did. Moreover, it appears unlikely on the face of it that either Confederation or Responsible Government will obtain a really large numerical majority at the second poll. The special factor which contributed to the success of the Responsible Government at the polls was, of course, the appeal of the proposal that Responsible Government should endeavor to negotiate economic union with the United States. As you know, the advocates of this plan ran a rather theatrical campaign, replete with advertising agency techniques which certainly must have impressed not an inconsiderable number of votes. Nor should one overlook the political force of Mr. Chesley A. Crosby, whose sincerity appears to be so taken for granted that a substantial body of people are prepared, as he puts it, to give him a chance. Jim Halley had his own explanatory postscript to the referendum results. Crosby became discouraged before the final vote, and after he read the results, he quietly disbanded the party and let everyone go their own way. Joey and the governor had been working on Crosby, and Joe told him that the Commission of Government or a new provincial government would call in the loans that Crosby businesses had from the government and forced him into bankruptcy. On the other hand, if Crosby would go along and not fight the second referendum, he would be eligible for contracts from the new government on a cost-plus basis. So Crosby and his construction company built the new wing of the Waterford Hospital and the new Memorial University buildings, and he became a wealthy man. With the second referendum at hand and the possibilities of a Confederate victory, J.B. McAvoy sent a letter to R.A. Mackay at External Affairs, setting out the political maneuvering afoot on the island. Mackay, in turn, passes it on to Paul Bridle in St. John's. A. Attached are copies of personal letters from Mr. J.B. McAvoy, formerly chairman of the National Convention and a prominent member of the Newfoundland Bar. As the letters indicate, Mr. McAvoy has been asked to take the leadership of the Confederate Party. I gather that Mr. Smallwood and others who have been disappointed by Mr. Bradley's lack of aggressiveness, Mr. McAvoy would certainly bring the Confederate Party considerable prestige and would undoubtedly make a dynamic leader. He has advised me by telephone that two of the commissions of government, presumably Mr. Walsh, Commissioner of Justice and Defense, and Mr. Quinton, Commissioner of Education and Home Affairs, and Mr. W.S. Monroe, the only surviving Prime Minister of Newfoundland, and a prominent businessman on Water Street, will come out publicly if he, McAvoy, assumes the leadership. I think Mr. McAvoy has already decided to accept, but he said he has business to clear up before any public announcement is made. Halley had this to say about these negotiations. Joey asked McAvoy, probably with Bradley's approval, to become party leader as a SOP to his vanity and to keep him out of the running for the premiership of the new province. Smallwood wanted several other things from McAvoy as well. Lester Pearson, who was extremely nervous that the extent of the Canadian involvement in the Newfoundland referendum process would become known, was stonewalling Smallwood's constant request for more details, information about federal departments. Smallwood hoped that McAvoy's close personal friendship with Mackay would, however, open up a channel for this information at External Affairs. And he was right. McAvoy was also on close personal terms with the governor, Sir Gordon MacDonald, and the member of the Commission of Government, all of whom could prove useful to Smallwood. As the lawyer and confidant of the Water Street merchants, McAvoy was in a unique position to persuade some of those eminent gentlemen to come over to the Confederate cause and give it an air of respectability. In due time, Smallwood's calculations proved fruitful on all accounts. Up to that point, McAvoy had managed to appear more or less neutral. As Don Jameson records, McAvoy had never publicly disclosed his political leanings, and given his mauritial temperament and massive ego, it was in character for him to play both ends against the middle. Before he took the plunge, however, McAvoy sought reassurances from Mackay, as Mackay reported to Bridle. Mr. McAvoy asks for information or opinion on a number of points, among them the following. A. Whether the existing Canadian terms are final and unalterable, especially in financial matters. B. Whether the Canadian government is merely lukewarm or indifferent to unity. C. Whether the present Newfoundland system of controlling fish exports would be wrecked by Confederation. D. Clarification of the statement in the Prime Minister's letter to Governor. Should the people of Newfoundland indicate clearly and beyond all possibility of misunderstanding their will that Newfoundland should become a province of Canada, Mr. McAvoy asked whether a bare majority would be considered sufficient. These same questions were vital not only to McAvoy as the new leader of the Confederation campaign, but also to most Newfoundlanders as they pondered the option of Confederation in the forthcoming second referendum. The Canadians and the British did not want to answer them. However, instead, they would set the rules of the game to their own advantage for as long as they could. And this brings us to the end of chapter 9. Thank you.